I'm going to put this over here, Bradley, right here. Whoa. Okay. All right, it's really good to see you on a cold night. Those of you who are brave enough to come out in a dress when it's this cold, I applaud you. Make sure you go check out Black Tie Affair, because it sounds like it's going to be fun. Brad Myers, man, he can play some music, so you don't want to miss out on that. If you are new here tonight, welcome. We are so glad that you're here. We hope that you come back. We hope that you take a minute and introduce yourself to us, to one of us. My name is Karla Chestnut. I'm on staff at Orchard Hill Church, and it is a real privilege to be able to come here on Thursday nights and worship together and to get to know each other a little bit. So, we're going to get started. We have just kicked off, Carter kicked off in a great way, a new series last week called The Red Letters. So I don't know if you guys know that in some Bibles, the letters of Jesus are in red. And the idea is that when you come to a red letter, you would pay some special attention because Jesus is saying the words. But as we talked about it in our team, we realized that sometimes you come to the words that Jesus speaks and you're like, yeah, Jesus, that's right. That's the Jesus I know. And then sometimes you come to some words that Jesus said and you're like, why did you say that, Jesus? What's that all about? So those are the things that we're going to take a look at through this series. So we're going to start tonight. But first of all, I just want to tell you a little story. And this is kind of a sketchy story. So I have to start out saying a few things first. January 4th, my husband Sean and I celebrated 21 years of marriage. Yeah. I would arm wrestle anyone who says he's not the best husband and father around. He's fantastic. I don't deserve him. Sometimes I take him for granted. He does incredibly sacrificial things to support me and encourage me. He is a wonderful, wonderful man. It's been 21 great years. We have 6 children. We like each other. We love each other, which is good. We like to spend time together. We laugh. We've been through good times. We've been through hard times. We often stop and kind of look at each other and say, I can't even imagine what it would be like not to be with you. Because who I am is so connected to who you are, and it's really good. Now, that doesn't mean it's always good. We've had times that we misfire emotionally. Our pace of life gets in the way, but overall, it's very, very good. Sean is a wonderful, kind, hardworking, loving husband, father, and I'm a fairly decent wife. Okay, that's the setup, okay? So here comes the story. So, we'd been married for 6 months. So this is a long time ago. And we had a huge and epic fight. And this really, I think we can look back and say this is kind of a hinge and a turning point for us on how we decided we were going to do life together. So it was summertime. We had ridden our bikes to Sturgis Falls. It's this festival that happens in summer in Cedar Falls every year. So we're at Sturgis Falls. We're riding home together, and Sean's just ready to go home. We have a babysitter. It's kind of late, and Sean wants to go home, and I want to go over to this friend's house because they're having a party, and I thought it would be fun. I'm a little bit more social than Sean, but we kind of were working on that. So I wanted to go home, he didn't, and he said, you know, if we go over there, then the babysitter's gonna cost more. So if you're doing the math, we had Nicholas, he's 4 years old. I had Nick when I was in high school, and then when Sean and I got married, Sean adopted Nick. So he said, you know, we're gonna have to pay the babysitter more, and I said something back like, well, we pay the babysitter $2 an hour, so I think we can afford that. Like I said, this was a very long time ago. And he said something like, well, that's interesting that you would say that, since I bring most of the money into this family. So I experienced anger at that point. I can't remember what I said in response, but I remember that Sean continued saying something like, you know, if it wasn't for me, you really wouldn't have very much at all. And Sean was working a really good job at that point, and I think I was working at the Hy-Vee pizza shop and still in school. And so this thing continued to escalate. I'm sure I'd said something in return, but I can't remember what it was conveniently. And Sean continued by saying, you know, really, if we weren't together, I wonder if you could even take care of Nick. So I guess, in the end, maybe Nick's really mine too. So things got really serious. And we got home, And I went into the house, and at that moment, I decided that I was going to do something with my anger. And I looked around our house, and I started grabbing things that belonged to Sean. And I said, this is yours, and I threw it out the back door. And this is yours, threw it out the back door. This is yours, this is yours, this is yours, take them. I don't need any of this. Then I looked over, and I saw the kitchen table. And I remembered, well, that was Sean's before we got married too. So I picked up the kitchen table, and I threw it out the back door. And I said, this is yours. Okay, that's the story. Try not to judge us too hard because we're doing all right. Okay, so we're going to look at the Bible now. These are the words of Jesus. Matthew 5:21 and 22. You, so he's talking to us, have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, remember this is Jesus talking, that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister or new husband or neighbor or coworker or roommate or mom or dad, anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka, we'll talk about later, is answerable to the Sanhedrin, which is a court. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in the danger of the fire of hell. So this is one of those times when you're reading along in the Bible and you come to this and you're like, whoa, Jesus, you just stepped it up a notch. All of a sudden we're talking about anger and being in danger of the fire of hell. So this is kind of intense. And you might say, why did you say that, Jesus? What's going on? So one thing I want you to remember about Jesus is this, that Jesus rarely communicated outside the nitty-gritty, everyday parts of life. It was almost always how he communicated with his people. He didn't call his followers to heroic deeds in the world before he called them to be heroic people in their everyday life when they face trials and tribulations. That's just who Jesus is. That's why I wanted to start with my story, because Jesus cares about your real life. Just like Jesus cared about my real life then, and he cares about my real life right now. That's just who Jesus is. Okay, so if that's true, and this is what Jesus means, then this is also what Jesus means when he says, I want you to repent. I want you to turn around. I want you to look at me because I want you to be able to experience the kingdom of my Father. And that's kind of where this piece of scripture is all nestled in. So let's look at it for a minute because there's some interesting things going on. So the next slide is going to tell you, we're going to look at these two things. So Jesus started out and he said, you've heard it said to the people long ago, do not murder. So that's in the Old Testament. That's one of the 10 commandments, right? I think it's the 6th, but I'm not sure. And then he says, but I tell you, and this is a really important thing for us to understand. Jesus is actually elevating himself above the Old Testament law. And that's a huge deal because the Old Testament law meant everything to the people of his day who were followers of God at that time. It meant everything to them. So Jesus elevates himself over and above the Old Testament law, but he does this really interesting thing. He doesn't cancel it, he doesn't change it, he doesn't correct it, and he doesn't diminish it. He doesn't say, oh, that's the Old Testament. You don't need to worry about that. He doesn't do that. He just elevates himself over top of it. So Jesus elevates himself, and that's going to become really important later on. Okay, you with me so far? Okay, Jesus elevates himself. And we were just kind of singing about this, actually. The Bible tells us that Jesus actually comes to fulfill the scriptures. He comes to fulfill this great story of God in the Bible. And this is what we mean when we say Jesus is Lord over all. This is what we mean when we say Jesus is Lord over everything. So, we're going to go on, but just think about this for a minute. If do not murder communicates God's great regard for human life, how much more does God regard human life when he says, I want you to be really careful about how you operate in your relationships? We just begin to get this picture. So what about anger? Because Jesus is not messing around here. So let's look at this. What about anger? Ephesians 4:26-27 could help us out a little bit with this. It says this. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not make room for the devil. I think that's really interesting in light of this verse. So what we want to be really, really clear about is that anger happens. Anger just happens. It's not a sin. Anger actually functions to alert us that there's a breakdown somewhere in our relationships with other people. And really, when you think about it, there is a lot to be angry about in our world. There's a lot of things that cause anger to bubble up inside of us. That's not sin. What is sin? And I think this is on the next slide. Sin occurs when I experience anger and I decide I'm going to carry it around with me for a little while. And then I begin pouring it out on other people. So it's this anger happens in my life, and I say, I kind of like welcome it in. You know, I kind of make a house for it. Think about, do you guys know the word pet peeves? You know, like you have this little pet peeve. If you think about a pet peeve, that's a little anger. So I don't know what yours are. One of mine is just like rude. Like you're just being rude. And that's my pet peeve. And I could make a house for that anger. And I could give it some snacks and maybe give it a little bed to sleep in and make it really comfortable in my life. And that's what we're being cautioned not to do. Because if we do that long enough, we become angry people. In my story, right, that I told you a little bit ago, I experienced anger. And the problem came about when I came home and I decided to start throwing things, right? Because there were a lot of other things I could have done. I could have said, dude, we've been married for 6 months. This is a big problem. We're going to need to get some help. We're going to need to go talk to somebody about this. Or I could have said, you need to calm down. I need to calm down. Let's talk about this in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. There's 100 creative things that I could have done differently other than start throwing stuff. Jesus elevates this value in this command. He elevates the value of reconciling instead of turning and pouring anger on people. He cautions us about becoming the kind of people who carry anger around with us and pour it out on people. So what about this raka and this you fool? That's kind of weird. But if you think about our culture, we have made an art form out of contempt, you know, out of saying things about people. There's games, right? There's apps. What is it, Your Mama app? What, are there others that you can think of? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, right? What are the funniest YouTube videos? They're the ones that people are just going off on each other, or totally dissing each other. It's just the way we live right now. Some of us are addicted to the adrenaline rush we get when we pour out that anger. You know, you guys know what I'm talking about. When you really get a head of steam and you just are letting people have it, or you're just abandoning yourself to the anger. You know what that feels like. So, where we're at is Jesus doesn't throw away do not murder. He deepens it. He goes further. He makes it more applicable to our life, right? To our everyday life. Because really, do not murder is pretty easy, right? Like if I'm all about a Christian checklist, I just check that off. Because I don't murder people. I'm not planning on murdering people. So I'm good there, which is great. I would love that. But that isn't really what Jesus is talking about. Just a little bit about raka. Whoa, that'd be bad. Raka is, like, think about the word for a minute. It's like, you know? You begin to get this idea of, like, getting a throat full of something and raka. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? We all have this in our life. Okay, we're going to go on. We're going to go on with the text. So, we talk about anger. We talk about getting that throat full of whatever it is to pour out on people. But Jesus does something else here that's kind of intense. He talks about judgment. He talks about a court. And then he talks about the fires of hell. All when he's talking about anger. So when you're reading along and you read this, you're like, Jesus, really? That's what I wanted to name this series. Like, Jesus, really? 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 You're really going to say that? The fire of hell when we're talking about anger? But if you think back to my story a little bit, a court, judgment, a court, and the fires of hell. It's not hard to imagine that if Sean and I had continued to behave with each other in this manner, that we would have ended up in divorce court. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you can't treat each other like that for very long and stay married, right? So we begin to see that Jesus knows exactly what he's talking about. And we can make all kinds of parallels to that in your life and the things that are going on in your life. But, so you think about that for a minute. So let's say that the last 21 years of my marriage didn't happen. When I look at that, I see that that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy of lost love, companionship, partnership, and raising a family. But that's just the judge in the court. What about the fire of hell? Well, think about this for a minute. We have 6 kids. So what happens when you grow up in a house where people are throwing things at each other? Well, not at each other. Well, it would probably progress to throwing things at each other, right? But what happens to people who grow up in a house where people are treating each other like that, where things are being thrown, when words are being hurled at each other? Isn't that pretty close to hell? That's a hellish way to grow up. And I know that some of you know firsthand what that hell is like. So we need to pause and we need to take this seriously because Jesus really isn't messing around here. Jesus elevates do not murder to the point where none of us have a chance of doing it perfectly. Does anybody in here never allow their anger to spill out on anyone? Just go ahead and raise your hand. Anybody got that? Okay, so we're all in the same boat. The point of the law, the point of this deepening, the point of this command is because it's futile. We can't do it without Jesus. Remember how Jesus a little bit ago elevated himself above the law? He said, you've heard it said, but I say. There's a reason for that, because the only way we have a chance is when we follow the elevated Jesus. And later he's elevated on the cross. So you begin to see this picture of what Jesus is doing in the world. Okay. So Jesus elevates himself so we can follow him. It's only by following Jesus that we have a prayer of living and becoming the kind of people who know how to receive anger. You feel it well up in your body, and we only have a prayer of dealing with it appropriately when we are following Jesus, so that's just my belief. So let's go on, because there's a little bit more to this verse. Therefore, this is Jesus talking again, and this is after he's talking about court, judgment, fires of hell. He says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. If you think about this for a minute, we could be the kind of people who all we ever do is check things off a Christian checklist. You know, I read my Bible, I didn't murder anybody, I prayed, I served at church, I led a class. You know, that we could become a people of a checklist. And we could become people who come to worship and we forget that the reason we worship is because Jesus made a way for us to be reconciled to God. That's the whole point of our worship. So Jesus knows this about us. There's no surprise that we're going to get to worship and discover this is true about our relationships. So the interesting thing that Jesus does here is he elevates reconciliation above religious activity. He elevates reconciled relationships above doing religious kinds of things. That's just like Jesus, isn't it? It's just the kind of stuff that Jesus does. It reminds me of a verse, and I don't know where it is, probably some of you do, but it says, my worshipers will worship me in spirit and in truth. I think it's when we become the kind of people that when we come before God, we're able to be vulnerable enough and real enough to have God kind of break in and remind us of the things that aren't right in our relationships with each other. So we're going to go into worship in a few minutes, and this is what I don't want you to do, and then there's something I want you to do, okay? I don't want all of you to get up and leave, because that's just making it another law, right, that we can check off. I can't stay here and bring my gift to the worship to the altar because I have something against my brother. You don't have to do that. It's just, are you open to becoming the kind of person that values reconciled relationships? Now, some of you might need to get up and you might need to go out and you might need to make a phone call. That might be entirely appropriate. Or you might need to go to the black tie affair and have fun with your friends and go home and write an email. Or you might need to make a coffee date. Or you might need to say, wow, Jesus, this is me. You're talking about me, but I have no idea what it looks like to stop pouring my anger out on the people around me. I just don't know what it looks like. So whoever you are, know that Jesus isn't surprised that you're in this place. He knows it. He knows us. And that's the really cool thing. So Jesus elevates himself so that when we fail, we can turn to him, we can be reconciled, we can repent, and we can return to God, and we can live our best life here, because eternity doesn't start when we die. Eternity has already begun for every single one of us sitting here. There isn't anyone in the room, whether you are a follower of Jesus or not, who isn't an eternal, ever-living, never-dying being, soul. And Jesus wants to come in and he wants to be the Lord of your life. So we're going to pray and then we're going to worship. Jesus, thank you so much for being God, and for without permission or without anybody saying, yeah, go ahead and do it, you just elevated yourself. You put yourself above all things, and then you promised to do a few things. You promised to be available to us. You promised to restore us.